We just have to wait for that to all recording good. Okay, great. Welcome everybody. My name is Christine Schmidt and I'm the Deputy Director and Head of Research here at the library, and we are really delighted to welcome you tonight. On behalf of the library and obviously all of our partners on this project, I'm very pleased to welcome you to this event, which is the public keynote lecture by Professor Dan Stone for our workshop for doctoral students and early career researchers, which is called Older People and the Holocaust. We are hosting tonight's lecture and the workshop in partnership with a number of institutions, which I'd first like to acknowledge. The Wiener Holocaust Library has a long-standing partnership with the Holocaust Research Institute at Royal Holloway, University of London, where Professor Stone is the director of the institute. Our collaboration, called the Holocaust and Genocide Research Partnership, aims to bridge gaps in knowledge between new research and public understanding of the Holocaust and genocide. And in line with this aim, tonight's event presents an opportunity to hear some of the overarching themes and questions that we are addressing in our workshop on this lesser known topic about the Holocaust, which is the elderly and the Holocaust. During the Holocaust, older Jews were among the first to be targeted for death or deportation to killing centers. Some wrote about their experiences in diaries and letters, and information can be found in other documentation and post-war testimony. Older adults are often grouped together with children, yet unlike child victims and survivors, there is little known about how older Jews endured persecution, how they responded, and about their survival strategies. So the workshop that we're hosting tomorrow derives from a broader project to highlight new research questions about this important topic. The project is being led through a partnership between the Wiener Holocaust Library, the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, the Foundation Remembrance, Responsibility and Future, also known as the Foundation EBZ, and the German Federal Ministry of Finance. And we are, through this project, publishing our forthcoming edited volume, Older Jews and the Holocaust, which is forthcoming in spring 2026, and which is co-edited by my colleague, Joanna Sliwa, and Elizabeth Anthony, who is here in the audience tonight. And that'll be co-published by Wayne State University Press. In the meantime, next November 2025, the Wiener Holocaust Library will also show a new temporary exhibition on the same topic. So if you're in London, please do come back and you can visit the exhibition. The partners are also grateful to the Ernest Hecht Charitable Foundation, which supports the work of the HGRP and the library more generally. Professor Stone's talk will start with the assertion by Polish historian Michał Głowiński that the 19th century ended for Jews with the death camps. He will examine the murder of the elderly during the Holocaust and post-war care for the few elderly survivors, as well as how the brutal treatment of the elderly exemplifies Nazi ideology's attack on the Jews per se, since their attitude to the weakest in society goes to the heart of what Nazism was all about. The murder of the elderly signified an overturning of 19th century notions of progress, in quotes, and freedom before the law. Now, before I more officially introduce our speaker, just a few words of the more prosaic on housekeeping. We don't expect a fire alarm, so in the unlikely event that that goes off, we have one entry and one exit from the building, so you please exit the building from the entry that you came in, and we'll gather across the street. If you need the toilets, those are out this door here to the back, and you can just take the stairs down, and we apologize that our lift is currently out of service. If you are joining us online, you will be kept on mute during the entire program, but you can post your questions in the chat at any time. And at the end of Professor Stone's lecture, we'll hopefully have time to get to as many questions as possible from everyone in the room and everyone online. And if you're in the room, please just wait for a microphone so that people online can hear you. So now to our speaker. Dan Stone is Professor of Modern History and Director of the Holocaust Research Institute at Royal Holloway, which I mentioned. He is the author or editor of numerous books, including The Holocaust and Unfinished History, which was published by Pelican in 2023. And he is currently writing a new book on the history of the Holocaust in Romania. So Dan, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Christine. Is that okay? Sound? Thanks very much for the kind introduction. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to speak here again. And thank you very much to Betsy and Christine and Joanna for including me in this book project. I'm really pleased to be a part of it. There's a huge literature on the aging of survivors and elderly Holocaust survivors today. That's not what I'm going to talk about, and it's not what the theme of our workshop is about. I want to talk about the elderly in the context of the Holocaust itself. So I'll start, as Christine indicated, with a citation from Michał Głowiński from his book, The Black Seasons. He, at one point in that book, refers to his maternal grandparents' unlikely survival as one of the miracles of the occupation years. He goes on to offer what he calls a digression about the fate of the elderly who had no chance of survival during the Holocaust, and writes, "For years, I've thought of the Holocaust as a slaughter carried out against those born in the 19th century, an enormous mass of people shaped in that century, living by the imaginations and ideas they absorbed in that era. A slaughter of those for whom the idea of murder by industrial methods was beyond comprehension, for the simple reason that it transcended the boundaries of their technological imagination. Sometimes I ask myself when the 19th century ended for Jews, and I think it was not at the moment it did for others when the First World War began, but rather at the moment when the crematoria in Treblinka, Auschwitz, and other such places designated for genocide were set in motion." So in the same way that A.J.P. Taylor famously argued that the First World War was, as he put it, the unexpected climax to the railway age, so Głowiński here suggests that the killing centers were the unexpected climax to the age of technological progress. If one takes Stefan Zweig's famous memoir as representative of his generation's experience, then Głowiński's argument makes sense. In a long, elegiac reflection on the achievements of the 19th century, Zweig writes, "People no more believed in the possibility of barbaric relapses, such as wars between the nations of Europe, than they believed in ghosts and witches. Our fathers were doggedly convinced of the infallibly binding power of tolerance and conciliation. They honestly thought that divergences between nations and religious faiths would gradually flow into a sense of common humanity, so that peace and security, the greatest of goods, would come to all mankind." When Zweig talks here about people, he is, of course, referring primarily to the middle-class Jews of Vienna. Similarly, in his novel about the Pisan Jewish community leader, Giuseppe Pardo, Silvano Arrietty writes of the mostly elderly people who chose to remain in Pardo's house on the north side of the River Arno after the Germans occupied that part of town. Following Pardo's attempt to persuade them to leave, Arrietty writes of Pardo's guests, "One by one they answered, as they had already done on many occasions. They had not noticed Pardo's special alarm. So this time, they answered in their customary manner, rather slowly and with an abundance of words, a habit that a certain class of people had retained from the period of the end of the 19th century and was zealously sticking to as an emblem of the glorious past. These people retained a special kind of formality, not just in their manner, but in particular words they chose to speak. Contrary to the way such speech would be interpreted today, this was a sign not of distance, but precisely of friendship and closeness, the identification card of a group of people who wished to preserve the niceties of life. The shattering of these dreams of the niceties of life, not to mention of unfettered and unstoppable progress, began for the Central European Jews with the experience of World War I, which was a cataclysm shared with the general population. But the Nazi killing centers were the places where Jews' dreams of and belief in equality before the law, common citizenship, and unmolested freedom in multi-faith liberal states finally came to a brutal and unequivocal end. This talk, I'm going to, in what follows, combine some theoretical reflections on the Holocaust as industrial genocide and as a marker of the end of the 19th century, with some more empirical comments about the murder of the Jews during and the care for elderly Jews after the Holocaust. A great deal has been written about World War I, signaling the birth of modern warfare, but following Głowiński and Zweig, there are good reasons for arguing that for the Jews, especially the Jews of Central and Eastern Europe, the Holocaust definitively closed that era, when notions of emancipation, religious tolerance, Jewish social and political progress, and civic acceptance came to an end. Using sources from before, during, and after the war by elderly Jews, post-war survivors' accounts, as well as documents from aid agencies, especially the London-based Jewish Committee for Relief Abroad, which we'll hear more about tomorrow, I'll argue that for the Nazis, the genocide of the Jews marked a revolt against the 19th century, understood as an age of progress. Although the thesis of the dialectic of enlightenment, which states in Walter Benjamin's formulation that there is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism, is well known and cliched, for the victims of the Holocaust, it was a huge traumatic shock to realize that progress had also contained the seeds of its own destruction. Nazism was not simply an anti-enlightenment revolt. It was a symptom of modernity, a vision of modernity that only makes sense in the context of prevailing notions of progress and civilization. Using the example of the elderly victims of the Holocaust, I want to suggest that Nazism's vision of destruction was total. In order to bring about the Aryan race's victory over the forces of the international Jew, there could be no compassion, even for the weakest and most vulnerable. Indeed, precisely the annihilation of the weakest constitutes the heart of Nazi thinking. So this talk offers a way of understanding the elderly victims, which shows both how the elderly and those who cared for them understood what was happening, as well as analyzing the perpetrators' motivations for targeting them. Above all, I argue that the annihilation of the elderly, though it has been largely overlooked, given that so few old people survived, was crucial to the Nazis' project to get rid of Europe's Jews. For the elderly embodied precisely those values that Nazism wanted to overturn: a sense of community, continuity, wisdom, protection of the vulnerable, revered elders. Above all, the Nazis regarded them, the elderly, as representatives of a different, soon-to-be superannuated age. Nazism was not, in Zweig's terms, a barbaric relapse. Rather, it was one expression of modernity's ability to incubate and then to channel forms of fantasy thinking, especially at moments of major international crisis. So I'm not subscribing to a simplistic notion of Nazism as a rejection of progress. Rather, following Adorno, and the references are on the handout, I work on the assumption that Benjamin's slogan is, as Adorno put it, not entirely without hope. That a situation can be envisaged in which, again, I quote, progress would transform itself into the resistance to perpetual danger of relapse. But this would be quite different from the 19th century notion of progress, which instated itself fetish-like as totality. So I'll start by talking about the experience of the elderly during the Holocaust itself. This is something that's often discussed in passing, since in accounts by survivors, the focus is by necessity on the young and the fit. But the majority experience during the Holocaust was not survival, but death. And for the elderly, that death was almost total. As historian Sarah Abrevaya-Stein notes of Aaron Hasson, not just one of the few survivors of the Holocaust in Salonika, but a 65-year-old, as she puts it, in the context of the survivor community of post-war Salonika, to be 65 was to be ancient, a relic of a lost world. The Nazis' rage against the Jews left no room to spare the weakest. Quite the contrary. Elderly Jews were often at a loss to explain what was happening to them, even the best equipped to do so. Cäsar Seligman, for example, born in 1860, and the president of the Vereinigung für das liberale Judentum in Deutschland, the Union for Liberal Judaism in Germany, from 1912 to 1937, completed a memoir of his life in 1941 after emigrating for Britain 2 years before. He noted that his life had been turned upside down. He was too old to learn English and was moving around the country from Aberdare in South Wales to Cheltenham, Cambridge, and London to escape the German bombs. When he and his wife moved to Oxford in March 1941, it was their 14th move in 2 years, and he was unable to make sense of it all. As he wrote, "As for my inner life, I hardly dare to portray it, because we have not yet reached, and likely will hardly be able to reach, the state of inner tranquil calm that is the prerequisite for objective reflection. We live in memories and hopes, that is to say, in the past and the future, and not in the present. The present is like an incalculably large sea. in the middle of which we are being hurled around by all the waves without being able to see a shore. Even before the killing process began, the Nazis targeted the elderly in ways that paved the way for further persecution. Numerous accounts testify to the mistreatment of elderly men in Buchenwald, Dachau, and Sachsenhausen in the wake of the November pogrom or Kristallnacht. Their experiences and the experience of other Jewish men seeing them made it clear that the Nazis would not stoop from attacking the most vulnerable and worked to persuade the German Jews that they needed to take emigration seriously. Although, ironically, it would most often be the elderly who were least able to leave the country. With the German Jewish emigrants tending to be from younger age groups, the result was that the group aged 51 and over, which constituted less than 1/6 of the refugees who settled in Palestine, formed a ratio almost 3 times as great within the population which remained at home, as a report of 1944 explained. Aged German Jews were subjected to measures that distinguished them from the elderly elsewhere, perhaps as a way of signaling to them, to their families, and to the wider Aryan community that they would be treated according to civilized standards. As historian Jonathan Zatlin has shown, the elderly German Jews were tricked out of their savings as the Nazis used the deception of old age care before deporting them to Theresienstadt. They were forced to buy retirement home contracts, Heimeinkaufsverträge, the German term I think captures the bureaucratic nature of this quite nicely, thus ensuring that the Nazi regime stole most of their life savings while creating the impression that they were to be cared for properly. In other words, the treatment of the elderly was essential to the success of the genocide, as Zatlin puts it, because it suggested to the elderly and the non-elderly, to Jewish and non-Jewish Germans, that the regime's intentions toward elderly Jews were honorable. But far from being cared for in Theresienstadt, the elderly suffered from hunger and overcrowding and were among the first to be deported to Auschwitz. The number of elderly who died in the camp rose rapidly from an average of 5 a day in May 1942, before the so-called Alterstransporter, transports of the elderly, to 32 a day in July, 75 in August, and 131 deaths every day in September. As the survivor and historian Josef Pollack put it, the elderly died often on the bare floor and had no mattress or blanket, much less medical care. Theresienstadt, we can discuss, it's a special case in the history of the survival of the elderly. But surviving documentation contains numerous examples of old people being murdered almost in passing, as if it had become so predictable and normal in the context of the assault on the Jews all across Europe that it barely merited a comment. Historian Wendy Lauer, for example, describes a killing outside Miropol in Ukraine on October 12, 1941. When they arrived at a clearing, the Germans began to shout, "Dig, you Russian pigs, kaput!" They sneered at the girls and began to pass the time. After the girls finished digging out a layer a few feet deep in a circular area about the size of a room, the Germans ordered elderly Jewish men to the site. The Jewish men completed the pit and were killed on the spot. That's it. These examples such as this are easily multiplied. In his report on Treblinka, one of the camp's few survivors, Abraham Krzepicki, noted, "Already we could see elderly people stretched out on the floor of the first car, half unconscious. We didn't like the look of this." At the other end of Europe, at the transit camp of Westerbork, from where Dutch Jews were shipped to the killing centers, the following occurred in July 1942. And I quote, "There now began the sort of spectacle that would be repeated hundreds of times with ever increasing horror. One of those selected was a young man who was to be separated from his aged father. The old man, a Polish Jew with a long beard, came to plead with them. We did not know then what sadists the Germans really were. So you want to stay with your son? All right then, you can go along with him tomorrow." That was all he got out of them. The same is true whether one looks at the ghettos or the camps. In Łódź, Chaim Rumkowski is remembered for his infamous "Give me your children" speech. Less well remembered is the fact that in that same speech, Rumkowski explained that he was being asked by the Germans to give up the best we possess, the children and the elderly, as he said. He said almost nothing further about the elderly, however, leaving one to assume, as he put it in an earlier speech, he had nothing to say about them other than, and I quote, as far as older people are concerned, working people's parents who are unable to work, I trust that God will not forsake them. The result is not hard to imagine. The elderly were, along with small children and the sick, the first to be deported, nor were they treated with any special care. Because the operation proceeded so rapidly, of the Łódź ghetto, the authorities gave no thought to the motives or causes of any particular act. At 38 Zgierska Street, an elderly woman from Sieradzь did not understand if she had been ordered to go to the left or the right, and instead of going to a wagon, she walked over to a group of Remainers. This the authorities interpreted as an escape attempt. The woman was shot to death on the spot. And so on and so forth. There are many such examples in the sources. So the elderly tried to cling on to their familiar world as long as they could. Rudolf Mrazek, the historian in Ann Arbor, gives the example of Alice Blumendahl, a Dutch Jewish woman in Theresienstadt, who, and I quote, had been approached by a Jewish official from the Council of Elders. Would you like to go to the Altersheim to be a woman reader? Mrs. Blumendahl did, and she recalled after the war, my listeners, they were often seriously ill, lay deep in their pillows. The listeners in one room varied between 7 and 20, but sometimes there were 40 and more. I began with Erinnerungen an Frauen. 2 novels, one by Ernst Petzold and the other by Theodor Fontana, followed. Then she read Heinrich Heine's Rabbi of Bacharach from the Book of Songs. By demand, Mrs. Blumendahl recalled, I have also read Geschichte Napoleons. Here, the 19th century truly invaded Theresienstadt. Blumendahl's description makes the ghetto sound like a Habsburg convalescent home. Soon after, for the Jews of Europe, the 19th century ended. It ended for them not because the Holocaust, following Głowiński, transcended the boundaries of their technological imagination, as he put it, although this was also probably true for many of them. Rather, the 19th century ended for Jews with the Holocaust because of the Nazi mania for a transvaluation of all values, which those brought up in the late 1800s had been taught to regard as immutable. I want to turn now, I have lots more examples in the paper, but rushing on for reasons of time, I want to turn now to talk about the post-liberation period. On encountering Belsen, one Canadian soldier observed that the thing that stuck in my mind was the age. All the elderly people had apparently died, and so the average age of those people there was probably in their 30s or 40s as an average age. But there was no people there over 60 or 65. Very little of those, I think. They had all been terminated and buried before we got there. I think he was wrong about the average age in general. The average age of survivors was much younger than 30s and 40s, but probably people looked much older than they were. Liberation needs to be written in quotation marks for the simple reason that even though they had outlived the Nazi regime, for the majority of survivors, the prospect of rebuilding their lives in the absence of their families, communities, and hometowns, without support networks, and usually in a state of mental and physical distress, meant the beginning of a whole new set of troubles. This situation was still the case several years after the war. Indeed, by the late 1940s, it had become more noticeable, given the existence of the so-called hardcore of displaced persons who could not or would not leave Germany, mostly because they were too old and sick. Their position was clearly set out by a JDC report of October 11th, 1949, beginning with the observation that of the 150,000 Jewish DPs, only a fifth remained. The report then explained, what remains is the pitiful rest of the survivors, the sick and the infirm. For them, the liberation was no liberation, but only opened the way to the sickbed. They could once be counted in thousands, but now their ranks have been depleted by their own inability to stand up to the impact of normal life and by their dwindling powers of resistance. Referring to the hardcore DPs as the survivors of the survivors, the report made recommendations for the physically and mentally ill, those with tuberculosis, and, quote, invalids, that is, those who had lost limbs or other body parts as a result of fighting against the Germans or being victims of medical experiments in Nazi camps. Finally, the report devoted a short section to the, as it put it, aged. It noted that the mass health examination in the DP camps that ended in December 1948 revealed that the elderly constituted the abnormally low percentage of 1.5%. This shockingly low figure, it argued, was the direct result of the organized destruction of European Jewry to which children and elderly people were most exposed. The report concluded that there were about 100 unaccompanied aged persons living in camps and installations who will need custodial care, and it recommended that in view of the wish of most of the remaining DPs not to remain in Germany, an old age home be established for them in Israel to which they could be transferred by April 1st, 1950, 3 months before the cessation of the International Refugee Organization. Of course, by the end of 1949, the majority of Jewish DPs had left Germany. Nevertheless, this statistic of 100 elderly survivors, plus another 100 elderly German Jews living in old age homes in Munich and Frankfurt, who didn't fall into this report's purview, is startlingly low, even without knowing precisely what the report means by aged, since they don't actually offer an age range. And even though the report covers the American zone only, where the majority of Jewish DPs were based. It's corroborated, however, by an IRO report from January 1950, which provides statistics on all DPs, not just Jews, and indicated that there were 90 unattached elderly Jews, aged over 60, here it's specified, and 22 Jewish couples in which one or both were aged over 70, who required institutional care, i.e. were classified as hardcore. The report is therefore testament to the almost total obliteration of the elderly Jews during the Holocaust. Elderly survivors then only rarely were accompanied by family members. In June 1948, Jakob Marx, who ran the Jewish old age home in Cologne, wrote to E.G. Lowenthal, the Jewish Relief Unit's German-born field director for Germany, with short biographies of the home's inhabitants. And here we get a little glimpse into who some of these people were. Annalie Fromm, born in 1868 and widowed in 1931, spent 3 years in Theresienstadt. She lost a son and a daughter in the Holocaust. Wilhelmina Israel, born in 1859 and thus nearly 90 years old at the time of this correspondence, had also spent the years 1942 to 45 in Theresienstadt, and she too had lost 2 of her 5 children to the Nazis. She was now living in the old age home, sharing a small room with her daughter, Emma Oppenheimer. The latter was born in 1891. Her husband was murdered by the Nazis in 1944, and she had a daughter living in Sweden, who she was trying to find a way to visit. Almost all of the inhabitants of the Cologne old age home were Theresienstadt survivors, the majority of them women. Marx rarely made any comments about them other than strictly biographical. But occasionally one gets a glimpse with respect to, for example, Helena Zierke, born 1866, who was widowed in 1944 and whose only son lived in Africa. Of her, Lowenthal wrote, "She is an old, frail grandma." Of Samuel Unger, born 1873, whose 2 daughters were killed in Riga and who was living in the old age home with his wife Flora, born 1874 and in good health, Marx noted that he was a suffering old man. And of Lena Oppenheimer, born 1891, whose 2 children were murdered by the Nazis and whose husband was, quote, 100% war damaged and had to be cared for like a small child, Marx observed that her lot is exceptionally hard. That's it. It's thus hardly surprising that when Lowenthal wrote sometime earlier to the Law and Security Office of the Cologne Housing Department asking for further assistance, he emphasized that many of the inhabitants of the old age home were, as he put it, former racial persecutees whose lives should be made as bearable as possible under the current circumstances. Yet 6 years later, as well as the Jews living in the old age homes belonging to the Gemeinden, the rebuilt Jewish communities in Germany, there were still elderly residents among the last group of 2,000 remaining DPs in Föhrenwald, the last DP camp to close. When David Rosenstein, president of the National Federation of Settlements and Neighborhood Centers, visited the camp with his wife in 1953, he was shocked not at the living condition of Föhrenwald's inhabitants, who were well provided for, but, as he put it, at the hearts and minds of this community, which 8 years after the war is still living almost entirely on relief. vegetating without constructive plans for the future. Among them were those in the old age group, men and women over 60. Rosenstein described them as tired and despondent people who look back on a life of misery and hardship, for whom resettlement planning is extremely difficult, if not impossible. He proposed attempting to persuade the Furstenwälders, about half of whom were returnees to Germany from Israel and elsewhere, to move to Israel. But having already said that resettling the elderly was next to impossible, he said nothing more specifically about them. The elderly, as was often the case, were not exactly abandoned, but nor were they a high priority, since presumably how they were going to make the rest of their lives productive was not a pressing issue for the Joint or for other charities. What we see in the post-war relief, to use the contemporary term, for the elderly is thus confirmation of Adorno's notion of progress. On the one hand, an attempt to revisit and revive 19th century values of respect for community and care for the weak. On the other, a sense that such action was really a sad but committed desire to help the surviving remnant of the elderly live out their remaining days in as much comfort as could be provided for under the straitened post-war circumstances. Requests for apple puree, floor polish, or books, as one finds in the JRU documents, bespeak a desire to grant the elderly inhabitants a basic, acceptable standard of living, not a commitment to reviving grand 19th century speculative philosophies of history leading to perpetual peace or the unfolding of Geist. This was not a return to progress understood as unfettered, something to be taken for granted and celebrated. It was rather a dedication to a kind of humanitarian care and a belief that in these circumstances, progress meant resistance to the perpetual danger of relapse. As both Adorno's thought and the empirical reality of liberation indicate, redemption, as Adorno, as Josh Cohen puts it rather, redemption must take the form of its unceasing refusal. So a kind of minimal version of progress, of care, without the kind of grand notions of the unfolding of some kind of philosophy of history. Let me end with a few thoughts about what this means. In his famous essay, Useless Violence, Primo Levi tried to understand what he calls orthodox Nazi logic. It's clear, he says, that for the orthodox Nazi, all Jews must be killed, including, of course, children and pregnant women, so that no future enemies should be born. But he is confounded by the Nazis' decision during what he calls the furious roundups across Europe to violate the houses of the dying, that's to say, old age homes. And this is what he writes. Why go to the trouble of dragging them onto their trains, take them to die far away after a senseless journey, die in Poland on the threshold of the gas chambers? In my convoy, there were 2 dying 90-year-old women, taken out of the Fossili infirmary. One of them died en route, nursed in vain by her daughters. Would it not have been simpler, more economical, to let them die, or perhaps kill them in their beds, instead of adding their agony to the collective agony of the transport? One is truly led to think that in the Third Reich, the best choice, the choice imposed from above, was the one that entailed the greatest amount of affliction, the greatest amount of waste, of physical and moral suffering. The enemy must not only die, but must die in torment. Levy, I think, understood, but also did not want to understand. It was indeed precisely the Nazis' intention that the enemy should feel the weight of their power, that the victim's suffering should be maximized. And in his example of the 2 90-year-old women, we see Nazi logic distilled. In order to save the Aryan race, all Jews must be killed. As Adorno puts it, one of the Nazis' symbolic outrages is the killing of the very old. For these 2 women, born in the middle of the 19th century, teenagers at the unification of Italy, and already approaching old age at the start of World War I, the deportation train to Auschwitz led not only to their murder. Their story also represents the murder of an age and its dream of progress. In one of the bleakest of post-Holocaust works of philosophy, probably the bleakest, Adorno wrote in Negative Dialectics of 1966 that, quote, "Since Auschwitz, Fearing death means fearing worse than death. He writes, "What death does to the socially condemned can be anticipated biologically on old people we love. Not only their bodies, but their egos. All the things that justified their definition as human crumble without illness, without violence from outside." And yet in Levy's example of the two old women placed on the train to Auschwitz, we encounter people who are experiencing the natural end of their bodies and minds and being forced into the category of the socially condemned, a kind of double dying. Having come to maturity in the age of progress, they were committed to die in the age of its dialectical antithesis. The havoc that the memory of fascism continues to play on the world stage indicates that apocalyptic fantasies continue to attract, especially at moments of crisis, and that belief in unidirectional social, political, or technological progress is not only naive, but dangerous. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Just coming back to the front. Sorry for all the technical, we had some technical issues online. Thank you for that. That was, I think, a very apt way to start our discussions tomorrow. But for now, we would like to give time for people in the audience, both online and in person, to ask questions. And if you're okay with that, and just wait for the microphone, and I'm happy to come to you.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. Especially thinking about the papers for tomorrow, I want to ask how historians can try to find agency in this, right? A lot of these papers are trying to do this. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an honorable goal. But even in my own work, I struggle with this, with maybe over-ascribing agency. Especially with, a multi-marginalized identity, aging, Jews, class, gender, all these papers are talking about this. So I want to ask, what do you recommend to historians? What do you see as the challenges or valuable goals of that?
It's a really good question. I think in the context of the elderly, it's a little bit like writing about children. From a methodological point of view, or in terms of the sources, not because the elderly and children are similar, but just simply in terms of the sources, that there are, it's very hard to find sources that directly tell us what elderly survivors thought and wrote. There are some. So, for example, in a previous book, I cited Richard Feder, who was the surviving chief rabbi of Czechoslovakia after the war, who was already 70-something when he survived Theresienstadt, and then published in 1946 one of the first works to be published in Czechoslovakia about the Holocaust in the post-war period. And it's a really remarkable book. But this is a man who was, had been a rabbi for many years, highly educated, writes violent, bitter invective against the Germans, and talks about how old people have lost their children, their grandchildren, and are devastated and have nothing to. We wonder why we've been left alive. He writes, what for? And so you can find occasional things like that. I think otherwise you just have to look around. I mean, I only cited some of the sources that I refer to in the talk. The written version is longer, but I think there are many sources that are yet untapped from this point of view. And I think, for example, a lot of literature pertaining to Orthodox Jews in general in Holocaust studies, but certainly for the Orthodox, for the elderly, could be very useful in this respect. I think there are files in the JDC archives, in Leo Beck, in many other places where you can find material. So there's no one place that you can go to for this topic. I think that's one of the things that we'll probably see tomorrow, that in order to try and get a kind of overview of the sort I've tried to provide here, you have to, it's a sort of grab bag from all sorts of places. But I mean, do you have an answer to your own question? No. I think probably, well, maybe we'll see some examples tomorrow, but I think in general, finding sources where we can hear the elderly in their own voices is quite rare.
Other questions? Is there one? Oh.
I have a question about the element of surprise. You spoke of the people, the unexpected eruption of hatred in ways which couldn't have been foreseen. And in particular, the great sophistication of European society, the music, the literature, and then the science. And I question why anybody would be surprised. Martin Gilbert's book on the Shoah has a long quote on the first page it's a quote by Voltaire. Did we think of Voltaire as a rabid anti-Semite? Yes. Would you like to quote what he says?
No.
You know what he says?
No, I don't.
It could be Nazi propaganda. You know, under this layer is this, and under this, and then there are the rats, and under the rats
are the, yes, is the Jew.
Under the rats are the Jews. That is. So what I'm trying to say is there are streams of horrific thought in the most sophisticated parts of society.
Agreed.
So we should never, I mean, I can't say that particular stream or that particular stream is a particular cause, but there's a horrific connection between sophistication and the ability to perpetrate terrible violence. And I think we have the cultural one, there's the Christian one. I don't think Voltaire was particularly speaking from a Christian point of view, so I'm sure you can find Christian strands. And then you have the scientific development, and the Germans perhaps felt, I don't know what the Nazis felt, particularly attached to their culture. It's well known that, well, I know I was married to someone from Holland, and in her family, well, her father had fled Germany, and there the soldiers, there was the Nazi party, and it was the SS who occupied Holland, not the Wehrmacht, and there they were in their bunkers in the dunes, and there they had their grand pianos. We know this because my wife's grandfather had a piano shop, and he deliberately took out of the pianos all the mechanisms so they couldn't say, can we have a piano? So I'm sorry, just terribly sorry, they're all not working. So culture and
Understood. I mean, I think we've become very familiar with this image of the piano playing Nazi, of culture and barbarism going hand in hand. That's exactly the point of referencing Benjamin's well-trodden quotation here. And of course I agree with you, and we know now that from the writings of the philosophes, Voltaire, Rousseau, Hegel, Kant, etc., are full of racism and anti-Semitism. Hegel talks about giving the Jews, emancipating the Jews not as Jews but as men. In other words, that for Jews to become citizens, they have to give up being Jews, etc., etc. Never mind what they have to say about the savage parts of the world, the people without history and so on and so forth. So the fact that the Enlightenment is riddled with racism and contains its own contradictions, we know. The founding fathers of America being slave owners, etc., etc. We're familiar with all of these things. I would only say the reason why this was still unexpected was because the 19th century sees empirically the betterment from a modern perspective of Jewish life, emancipation, the granting of citizenship to Jews, the ability in most countries in Europe, the exceptions of course are Russia and Romania, and the majority of Jews are able, this is of course because they're granted the rights, and there are debates within the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, about whether this is good for the Jews or not. But nevertheless, the majority of Jews are able to start to behave like the rest of the citizens of any given state. And so for by the time we reach the late 19th century, of course, this then becomes the age of degeneration, of race theory, of eugenics, of all the responses to the modern world, which, of course, all go hand in hand with anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. But nevertheless, taking part in those debates, the Jews are able to engage in them through political parties, through voting, through newspapers, through theatre, through the same activities as citizens as other members of the community. And in that sense, I think it's the granting of emancipation that's really the crucial thing here. The fact that Jews, what was unexpected was that the overturning, I think, of that citizenship, and the sense that Jews were no longer fully people. So I completely agree. There were, you can find many authors who predicted what was to come. I don't necessarily think they had greater insight than others. It was one of a range of possible options, and they happened to be correct at the time. But there were many who foresaw terrible things for the Jews. It wasn't hard to predict in terms of what was being said in race theory and elsewhere. The rise of proto-fascistic movements in Vienna and elsewhere. Nevertheless, Jews, I think, felt, certainly in many parts of Central and Western Europe, that they had the same rights as everybody else.
Thank you, Dan, for your talk. You began with Michał Głowiński, who was a Polish Jewish child survivor, and I wonder about what geography or how geography played a role in how the 19th century ended for the Jews.
Can you say a bit more about what you mean?
A bit more, okay. So you started with the Polish-Jewish perspective of a child survivor, right?
Yep.
And then you also referenced several other writers. So I wonder if geography, their geographic location, played a role in how they thought about the experiences of Jews and how the 19th century ended for Jews.
I'm not sure how to answer you.
Or even how geography, I think, played a role in the experiences of Jews, because you wrote about...
No, go on, sorry to interrupt.
Please, yes.
Well, I mean, I haven't thought of this paper as through the lenses of spatial approaches, right? I haven't thought of it in that way. Clearly, the Holocaust itself and the way it played out in different places was shaped by geographical concerns. Size of territory. The Netherlands is a good example. Whether a territory was heavily penetrated by the SS or by the occupation regime or not, whether a country is flat with nowhere to hide or large and mountainous and so on. It's not the only reason why 75% of the Jews were not deported, but geography plays a part in that, I think, and one reason why 75% of the Dutch Jews were killed. In Poland, it's very difficult. I mean, I have reservations about thinking geographically in these kind of terms, because you can see how, for example, ghettos, camps, etc., confine people in certain ways, how the ability to hide, to pass on the Aryan side, etc., was also shaped geographically to a large extent. But Poland is also the epicenter of the Holocaust, where 3 million of 3.3 million Polish Jews were murdered. So in a sense, I want to conclude that geography was not relevant here, that when the Nazis had the means and the drive to kill everyone, they did. And that, I suppose, in the cases of places like France, for example, the ability of Jews to hide in the south of France was something that probably made the Nazis think at the time, okay, we'll sort it out later. And that facilitated their survival. So it's not a very good answer to your question. The answer is I haven't really thought about this geographically, but one could, I'm sure.
I have a question from online from Imogen Dalziel, who would like to thank you for your presentation. And she asked, were there any notable differences, at least initially, in the treatment of older German Jewish First World War veterans compared to the older non-veteran population?
Thank you, Imogen. Yes, the answer is yes, that, at least in theory, that World War I veterans, Jewish World War I veterans, were supposed to be protected from various, from the Aryan clause in the first laws that threw people out of their jobs in the civil service and teaching and so on, and were supposed to be protected for the time being. And this was no accident, of course, because those Jews were likely to be among the most conservative nationalist of the German Jews, and there was a substantial number of German Jews who were ultra-nationalist German in their opinions, and who, had they not been Jews, would most likely have become Nazis. Small number, but nevertheless a substantial group. And so those sorts of measures in the first instance were designed to suggest that, if you were patriotic and a good citizen, then your Jewishness was not necessarily an obstacle to continuing to exist in the Third Reich. And as with all such things, I don't want to suggest that this had been thought through in advance, that this was a ruse deliberately set up in order that they could then later overthrow it, but it's had that purpose. So it's served a way of helping the majority non-Jewish population to accustom themselves to what the Nazis wanted and to coordinate themselves with the regime, as well as suggesting to Jews that it wasn't everybody that was necessarily being targeted all at once. So yeah, there was a difference.
I also have a question, actually, for the, sorry, I've totally lost my train of thought, but for the actual sources that were written by older people, did you find that linguistically they described atrocities of the Holocaust similarly to people of other ages, or did they kind of maybe compare it to different events and things like that?
I have so few that it's really hard to answer that question. I can think of, for example, the Feder text that I referred to before is doesn't really dwell on atrocities in the sense that it doesn't provide endless horrible details, but is nevertheless, as I said, extremely bitter about what has happened, and he's left wondering why he's alive. And I instinctively want to say there isn't much difference really in terms of the way the persecution process is described, but that's based on very little evidence, I have to admit. Those sources are so unusual. Maybe we'll hear more tomorrow. Actually, that would be interesting to find out.
Other questions?
Thank you. I have a question about stereotypes and biases when it comes to elderly people. So with the lack of sources, very often we're left with musings that we have about the way elderly Jews or other people who were persecuted thought about, reacted towards certain happenings during the Holocaust, and the way they then also chose for themselves what to do next, what not to do. And so sometimes, we base then our musings on wider readings, but I wonder how much of what those musings are may be based on just notions that we have nowadays about of elderly, of being inflexible, and also things. When you mentioned World War I veterans, I was thinking their experience of the war, right, also meant developing a considerable level of resilience, of flexibility, and that's something very often that we don't really perhaps attribute to elderly kind of a priori, but then maybe highlighted as, very interesting that this elderly person showed proactively that they are against a certain Nazi legislation. And so I was wondering, how do you relate to this? This notion of us researchers having certain ideas about elderlies and projecting them perhaps on them. And would you say that maybe the stereotypes that we have now about elderly are, can we say, well, there's a continuum in the 1930s? I mean, especially when it comes to Nazi propaganda, we have ideas of, elderly being people who need to be cared about, people who cost money, people who are inflexible. So would you say that those stereotypes are in a way, transferable? We can, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a really thoughtful question. I think you're right insofar as many of the stereotypes that we find in the sources conform to, not necessarily with our stereotypes today, but are written from the point of view of the stereotypes held by the people who wrote them. So people who are, like the guy from the American settlements movement who's visiting Fürstenwald, or the JRU worker who's responding to the people in the Cologne old age home and so on. There's a natural tendency in their descriptions to ascribe to the old people all the things you've just described as kind of stereotypes, inflexibility, resignation to their lot, no hope for the future, etc., etc. And Roxy we'll talk tomorrow about the same thing being shown in the photographs of the elderly, exactly the same stereotypes used for fundraising purposes. We don't actually know. I mean, the people who are photographed, the people who are, whose names I read out and their ages and what happened to their children, we don't know anything about them. All right? I mean, in the same way that we sometimes hear today, in the context of debates about queer history, for example, this is not really an appropriate methodology for Holocaust studies because it might be offensive to survivors. It's like, well, presumably of the many survivors, there might actually be some who are queer, and the same is true here, right? That we ascribe certain ideas to the elderly. We don't know. Of course, yes, they're going to be all different in terms of their politics, their religion, their class, their status, their attitudes towards everything. And in the absence of knowing what those positions are, I think we're left with the sources, and I tried not simply to replicate in my own voice what those sources say, but you're right to say that those sources do provide a kind of stereotyped portrayal of the elderly. Yeah, I think that's a really thoughtful point, actually. Thank you.
We have another question from online, from Beth Purser, who said, you mentioned Primo Levi and his noting that it would surely have been more efficient to kill the elderly in care homes, hospitals, etc., rather than transporting them. Do you know to what extent this actually did happen? To what extent did elderly people were killed quickly rather than transported with younger populations?
Off the top of my head, no, but it's a good question. But I think that in general, when groups of people were transported, everyone was transported. I don't think if you look at whether it's Vienna or Bratislava or Salonika or Rhodes, I don't think it made any difference. And when the Polish Jews were deported to Treblinka, they didn't leave the elderly behind and kill them on the spot. Everybody was sent to their deaths. So there may well be exceptions, but I think in general the answer is no.
Except we'll hear from Emanuela's paper tomorrow about the exception in France.
Right, okay, so there are exceptions.
Before 1943. Yeah. Any other questions? Joanna?
You can tell that I have many questions. So Dan, you were among the pioneers of research on the elderly Jews during the Holocaust. After the Holocaust, you wrote about survivors, right? And so I wonder, from your perspective, what are the key or outstanding questions about the fate of the elderly or Holocaust survivors, elderly Holocaust survivors? Or another way to think about this question is, what would you like to see in future research on this topic?
I think, first of all, that's a question that's probably better answered by the people who are speaking tomorrow in the workshop. But my answer is really going to be about what I would like to see in Holocaust studies in general, not just, although it applies to the elderly too. I think that the revival of the concept of class is long overdue, that more research on class and status and social position that has for many decades been unfashionable for obvious reasons, I think needs to be revisited. I think there needs to be much more research done on religion as a category. I don't mean, of course, by this interpreting history through a religious framework, but writing the history of religious Jews, because I think historians who, around the so-called developed world tend to be kind of left, liberal, secular people, have forgotten the fact that the majority of the Holocaust victims were actually religious Eastern European Jews of one variety or another. And so I think there's a kind of separate body of scholarly literature on halachic responses, rabbinic response, etc., etc. And it exists in Orthodox Jewish milieu, but it needs to be incorporated more into Holocaust history, I think. I think there's more coming with respect to family history, the use of private archives as historical sources, I mean, Holocaust historiography is so much more innovative and methodologically diverse now than it was 10 or 20 years ago. So I don't want to predict what the next turn will be, after the material, spatial, forensic, etc., etc. But I think that some of the topics that I just mentioned provide a kind of way forward that maintains a kind of rootedness in social history, but also allows for interdisciplinary engagement with other cognate disciplines.
Okay, other questions? Others online? Good. Oh, two more. That's okay, I'll come to you.
Along the lines of, I have the same question for tomorrow, like trying to find sources, and maybe not geographical, but post-war political. So the idea that you could be a Jewish survivor in Russia is much different. That identity, I wonder whose story gets to be told about their identity, whether it's the elderly Jews that survive in Russia don't necessarily get to tell their story because they're not victims. Everyone's a victim, and how that plays out today. So like my story, part of my research tomorrow is about Baranovich and Belarus today. So current political issues in Eastern Europe make it difficult to get the sources. So I wonder, I guess those are more comments than questions.
Yeah, appreciated. Of course, you're right. I mean, that's reflected in the sources, and it's reflected. I mean, I think you meant when you said whose voices get to be heard. You mean in the post-war period, not But the same is true today, of course. And Belarus is a particular complicated case, right? I mean, Belarus was basically destroyed, like razed by the Nazis, and not just the Jews, but the destruction of villages across the whole of Belarus was really something extraordinary in the context of World War II. So, which still, I think, goes a lot to explain contemporary politics in Belarus, the sense that under Lukashenko people have, a better standard of living than they had 2 generations ago is not irrelevant, I think, to his regime. But under those conditions, of course, the ability of elderly Jewish survivors to speak out is severely curtailed. And it was curtailed also in France, in the Netherlands, in all parts of Western Europe, but for different reasons. There was, at least in Western and parts of Central Europe, a kind of the creation of a charitable network of support and community support and work of the Amical, the survivors associations and so on, to which people could belong and could speak openly, at least, even if in small circles about their experiences. So it was circumscribed in Western Europe too, but rather different, I think, from Belarus or the Soviet Union.
Okay, a question here.
Yes, hi Dan. Sorry, I missed your first 5 minutes, so apologies if you've already mentioned it. But you talk about Theresienstadt as a special case for the survival of a certain group of elderly Jews. Are there other contexts that somehow contributed to survival, or this like 1% of elderly Jews survivors, it was just completely random and casual?
In general, it was random, I think, that in every setting, certainly in the research I've done, and I've looked around a kind of wide array of different settings, from ghettos and camps and people in hiding and so on. In every setting, there's a small number, a random number of, but always small, of elderly survivors, whatever we call elderly, over 50 or over 60 or whatever. It's always a small number. The vast majority of survivors are from the age of about 13 to the age of about 30, because they're the group that were fit enough to survive. Theresienstadt, Betsy, Anthony in the audience knows more about this than I do, so you can ask her. But I have a few statistics here that I didn't read out. So I mentioned Jonathan Zatlin, who wrote about these care packages, that the elderly German and Austrian Jews were supposed to sign up to, and he says, in the end, 13.4% of German Jews sent to Theresienstadt survived, but only 5% of the elderly. So 5% of the elderly who were sent to Theresienstadt survived, but that 5% is still quite a large number. So and why it's unusual is Theresienstadt was the holding camp for the elderly German, Austrian and Czech Jews. And so when we look at the numbers of surviving elderly Jews, the vast majority of them come from Theresienstadt. So there's something like 5,000 or 6,000. Betsy? There's a handful of thousands of elderly Jews who survived Theresienstadt. And that's the single largest cohort of elderly survivors that you can find. Otherwise, everywhere else, there's this kind of dotted, random, tiny numbers of people.
And we have another geographical question from Jan Lamberts online, who asked, do the older Jews from Eastern Europe with a long regional history of pogroms share in assumptions about the march of progress?
Thank you, Jan. It's a kind of leading question, so I'll say no. Again, I think it depends where. I think the Jews of Warsaw probably had a different answer to that than the Jews of Volhynia, let's say. That's to say that where Jews were Polish-speaking, middle-class, assimilated, then probably they did share those notions, yes. But in the poorer, more monocultural settings of the shtetls, then probably the answer is no. Although, again, we have to kind of check our own stereotypes, because, of course, even in the shtetls, debates had been ongoing for generations about the Haskalah, about the merits of Jews engaging with wider society, etc., etc. It wasn't fiddler of the roofland. There were people engaging with the wider world and bringing those ideas back to their communities. So, Jan, I don't know. I don't think we can say yes or no. Again, I think it really would vary very much depending on where you look.
I think we had one more, but I don't. Is it Olga?
Hi, thank you. As a researcher of Hungarian Jewry, so suicide is quite common, right, among elderly Jews. So I'm wondering, is it because it's the end of the war, and even though they kind of often say that they didn't hear about Auschwitz beforehand, but I was wondering if suicide is also common or existing at the early stages and in other countries.
In Germany, I think, yes. If you look at Christian Goeschel's work on suicide in the Third Reich, there's actually, yes, the suicide rates are quite, I can't remember the statistics off the top of my head, but they're quite high, and of course they go up and down in response to what's happening in Germany. So after Kristallnacht, suicide rates are quite high, and you know, when deportations begin and so on. And I certainly think that among the elderly, there's a sense that you know, there's no point to this anymore, and that's certainly clear in various suicide notes that we have left behind. So yes, I think probably, and that's we need to be careful. Probably true elsewhere, but for Germany, certainly, I think, yeah.
Okay, I think we probably have to close. Unfortunately, there's so many good questions, and I hope that these conversations will continue tomorrow. I should say, unfortunately, for those of you who are not involved in the workshop, it is a closed workshop, but my colleague Catherine is writing a report of the workshop, which will be available publicly, and maybe there'll be a second volume. I don't know, I'm looking at my co-editors, I don't know. So anyway, thank you so much for all of your questions, and especially thank you to Dan for your generous time and generous time answering all of the questions. And on behalf of all of us in this project, I wanted to thank you all for coming this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.